If you're a photographer, chances are your editing style has changed since you started shooting. I think it's inevitable as an artist that your art will sort of grow and shift and change as you do. I certainly have gone through so many different phases of my journey in editing. Even if you look back at the beginning of this channel 2 years ago, you can see how much my work has shifted. After I took my business full-time back in July, I went through a period of reckoning with my editing style. I was in this phase where I didn't really know what I wanted my work to look like. My work was not consistent. It wasn't exciting to me. I didn't feel good about it. And so I needed to figure out how to edit photos in a way that I liked. At this point, I feel like I've finally figured it out, and I'm finally satisfied with my editing style. And there's something so comforting about that. It also encourages me to be more creative when I'm shooting because I know what I can do with the images in post. And so today in this video, I'm going to show you how I edit my photos. And this is not for you to copy the way that I edit. I don't think you should. I think you should figure out what works for you, what gets you excited. But hopefully by understanding how I work on my images, you may learn something, you may be inspired, and hopefully it'll help you in your own journey to find an editing style that you are fully satisfied with. So let's jump into Lightroom and talk about editing. Okay, so here we are in Lightroom, and I have a few images from a recent photo session that we're going to be working on. Now, before we get into the photos, I want to tell you a little bit about my editing style and why it is the way that it is. So what are the things that are important to me when it comes to my photographs? Well, I want them to look timeless. I want them to feel elegant. I want them to feel almost photojournalistic, a little bit editorial style. I want the viewer to look at the images and not think, wow, those have been edited. I want them to be images that print well. I want them to be images that the couple will look back on years from now and think, wow, what a beautiful day. I want them to remember the moments that are captured. And I don't want the experience of remembering or viewing the images to be sort of muddled by editing that goes out of style. So it took me a long time to figure this out, but now I'm gonna share all my secrets with you. Secrets. Okay, so this is a shoot, an engagement shoot I did with these really sweet clients last week. I shot the session on my R5 with my 50mm lens, and I also had Dune shooting with me. She was shooting on her R6 with her 24-70. So some of these photos are mine and some of these are Dune's, who was second shooting for me. So let's start up here with this image. Really beautiful image. They did really well in their choice of outfits. I think they look super cute. And the color palette goes really nicely with the palette at the beach. It was a sort of weirdly overcast, rainy kind of day in Santa Barbara. So we have this really nice, even lighting. And as we go into the session, you'll see that the beach sort of became this giant softbox and made the absolute most beautiful light. So that is one thing that is so important, is you have to know how to shoot before you can edit the photos, right? So editing will not save bad photos. The photos have to be great. And if you look at this image, it looks beautiful right out of my R5. And that is the thing that took me so long to figure out. You don't need to do a whole lot to finish this image. And so that's going to be a key to this new way of editing. Okay, so if you look over on the left-hand side, you'll see I have 2 presets that I use. And now these are the only 2 presets I've been using for everything. I have one called Pro 400H and one called Tri-X. Now, both of these presets were created by me using the Archetype Process film profiles. So if you haven't watched my video on the Archetype Process, you should watch that video to understand a little bit more about these film profiles. Now, these are not presets, these are profiles. They are kind of expensive. They're about $200 for each pack. The ones that I use are the Fujifilm ones and the monochrome ones, specifically Pro 400H and Tri-X, as you can tell by my preset. And these profiles are a way for Lightroom to interpret colors within a raw file. And so what I love about them is they create a really unique and interesting high-end professional look. They sort of tweak the colors in a really beautiful way that doesn't look over-edited, that doesn't look artificial, that doesn't look like presets. So I really love these profiles because I feel like they are the little spice that creates something really interesting in the colors of my image. So they're the foundation of these presets, and I'm really happy with them. It took me a long time to fully understand the archetype process profiles, and I still feel like I have a ways to go, but I'm understanding them more and more, and I'm really loving them. The other thing you should know is that all of these images are raw files. I was shooting compressed raw on the R5, and Dune was shooting in the full raw on the R6. You can tell me if you see any difference, but I don't really see a difference between full raw and compressed raw. So just keep that in mind moving forward. So let's go ahead and apply Pro 400H and see what happens. So there you go. Instantly, the image looks beautiful. Here's a before, there's an after, before, after. Okay, so what's happening here? We're seeing a little bit of a color shift, a little bit more contrast. The image just becomes a little bit warmer. And let's take a look at what we've changed. So up here, you can see the profile that's being applied is Pro 400H plus 2 normal frontier at 35%. This is key because I don't want the images to feel over edited. You'll see if we put this profile at 100%, it looks too edited to me. Now you can combat this by tweaking things like contrast or any of these adjustments in the basic panel. But what I've landed on is just keeping it at 35%, maintaining a lot of the same look that we had originally, but adding a little bit of pop of color, a little bit of interest. And then in the basic panel, I've made minor adjustments to highlight shadows and blacks and pull down the vibrance a little bit. And that's pretty much it. Now, another big part of this preset is in the tone curve. So you can see that's a before and that's an after. And again, they're just slight adjustments. So we bring down the highlights, lift the lights, bring up the darks, and bring down the shadows. There are also some adjustments to the curve here. So you can see what this is doing. So that's a before and that's an after, before, after. And again, this is a lot to taste. So if this doesn't suit your taste, try something else. The HSL has also been tweaked a little bit because sometimes the archetype profiles can affect skin tones in a negative way. So I find that if skin tones are not quite right, usually I will adjust the white balance first, white balance and exposure. But if I need to dive in a little bit deeper, I'll move into the hue, saturation, and luminance, all of which have been tweaked here. Color grading is interesting as well because I've added a slight warmth in the color grading in the midtones and the highlights. So you can see in the midtones I have hue of 49, saturation of 9, and in the highlights I have hue of 63, saturation of 9, and I brought down the luminance slightly. Now, this is something that I do change occasionally because sometimes the warmth is not something that I want, but you can see here this is a before and this is an after. So I think for this image, and in most circumstances, if I'm shooting in natural light with this preset, the warmth is a necessary addition in my opinion. It's just, again, a taste thing, but I really like it. Now, one big change that I've made recently is I stopped adding grain to my images. So I no longer add grain. I used to swear by grain. I would add grain. I talked about how much I loved grain. I found multiple different ways of using grain. Don't do it anymore. And you know what? I love it. I love not adding grain. I think it is just a really easy way to heighten your images, which seems obvious, but I think a lot of people add grain because there's this obsession with film. The thing is, I spend thousands and thousands of dollars on professional high-end new cameras and professional high-end new lenses. And I want my clients to have the best possible quality images, which these cameras produce. And by not adding grain, there's this sense of elegance, this sense of high-end photography. And it's sort of like blown my mind. I have to thank Dune for this, for changing my mind on the grain, but I just don't do it anymore. Maybe I'll change my mind again later, but for now I'm no grain. So there's no grain in this preset. I do add a little bit of noise reduction if I'm shooting at really high ISOs, but my R3 is incredible in low light, so I only have to add very minimal. Same with the R6 and even the R5, honestly, though the R5 is not as good in low light. It doesn't have as good ISO performance. I don't really like noise reduction very much, but in some circumstances it is necessary. So here I just have the base noise reduction. Lens corrections are on. And then I don't really use transform unless I have warped buildings or lines or things that I need to fix. And I don't change the calibration at all either. So that's sort of an overview of how I edit my images. So then for this image particularly, I think it looks really great right out of the camera with that preset applied. So I would just, remove these people. The new version of Lightroom has this really handy eraser, content aware remove. So this you can just click and it'll take them out. I love this feature. It doesn't work all the time, but it works for a majority of the time, and it's made my life so much easier. Okay, moving on to the next photograph. This is straight out of the camera. So you can see how beautiful the light is, how much the color palette of their wardrobe helps. So let's apply Pro 400H. And you can see immediately this image comes to life. It has warmth, skin tone looks beautiful, contrast is there, colors are gorgeous. And this is probably all I would do for this photo. No other changes. I may use my clone stamp to reduce some of this sort of seaweed and sand blemishes here just to make sure that the focus is on them in this sort of minimal photo. Maybe take out some of these wrinkles. But other than that, this image looks great, so we're going to move on. Let's apply the Tri-X profile for this photo. So you can see, again, like with one click, this image looks beautiful. We're using the Kodak Tri-X normal profile as the base with some basic adjustment tweaks. So I've brought down the contrast quite a bit here. The other thing that's interesting is I've added warmth in the color grading. So in the global, I'm at 52 at 10, which just warms up the black and white, and it creates a really, really beautiful effect. I also have to thank Dune for this as well, for opening my mind to the possibility of warm black and white photos. Who knew? So here is a before and there's an after. And again, no added grain here, which is making this photo look really high-end and beautiful. Now, let me just show you what it looks like with grain. So I have 3 different grain settings here. 1 is very minimal. 2 is a little bit more present, and 3 is just crazy. So I could add this if I wanted to, but I don't. So we're going to remove it, and that's what the photo looks like, and we're going to move on. Okay, here's another image. We're going to add Pro 400H. The photo is great here as a base, as the raw file, but this preset really just elevates it. She is looking a little bit too warm, I think, in the skin tone, so I may bring down the white balance just to sort of combat that a little bit. But I actually think for this photo, since they're sort of cut off already and it's sort of this awkward composition, I would just crop this so we're just seeing their hands. And since I'm shooting on the R5, there's a lot of detail here. I can just crop right in. And then this becomes this really gorgeous detail of them with their hands on the beach. Again, we can use our content aware remove to remove this person at the back, and then that's the image. So this is a before and this is an after, and that to me is a really creative, beautiful photo that we just made from that awkwardly shot photograph by cropping it to a more reasonable composition. Okay, here's a classic piggyback. So we apply Pro 400H. For this image, I'm going to bring up the exposure. I'm going to bring down the highlights and the whites so we can see a little bit of the beach behind them. It was kind of a washed out sort of day, like I said, really bright, softbox-like outside, so there wasn't a lot of detail in the sky to begin with. So this looks great to me. It's a little bit cool, I think, so I might bring up the white balance slightly and maybe bring up this exposure a little bit more. And this is a before, this is an after. All right, so here's a blurry photo. Now, this is another interesting thing. I changed my way of shooting blurry images. So I used to use an ND filter, and then I realized that I didn't need an ND filter, and it was so much easier not to use one. So if you look up here in my settings, I have my shutter speed at 1/30th of a second. I'm at f16 at ISO 100. So that allows me to get a little bit of motion blur in this image. So basically I just had them in the water sort of moving around, and I'm sort of just moving my camera slightly to get a little bit of blur. And you can see what it does is create this sort of painterly effect where the image looks more like a painting than like a photograph. I've had people hating on blurry photos and saying it's a trend, etc. Maybe it is, but I love it and I'm still going to be shooting with it. If you don't get it, that's fine. Your whole gallery is not going to be blurry. But I do think it's a nice addition to a set of images for a more artistic look. So we're going to apply Pro 400H, which already looks pretty great. We're going to bring up the exposure, and we're going to bring down the highlights and the whites to bring back some of that detail. Bring up the exposure a little bit more. And then this feels a little bit cool to me. So we're going to bring in some warmth here. I may bring down the overall exposure and bring up the shadows slightly since they're a little bit in the shadow. Maybe bring down the exposure. So this is primarily what I do with this preset is I'll apply it and then literally just tweak the white balance and the temperature and the tint, and then the exposure, maybe the contrast and some of the basic adjustments, but that's pretty much it. So this is a before and this is an after. So you can see we really brought this creative image to life. This is an image that Dune shot that I absolutely love. It's probably my favorite image of the whole set. Really simple, but beautiful. So we're going to apply Pro 400H, and right off the bat, this looks really great. I'm going to bring up the exposure slightly. I'm going to bring up the warmth. That's a before, that's an after. Absolutely gorgeous. Here is a sort of Michelangelo reaching image. I'm just going to click previous to apply the settings from right before. I think we're going to bring down the exposure. I might actually return the white balance to where it was originally. And for this, I'm just going to crop in slightly so we have just their arms in the frame. And that's it. Beautiful. And you can see when you zoom in here how much detail you have because there's no grain. It's amazing. All right, so here's another image applying Pro 400H. We're going to bring up the shadows. We're going to bring down the highlights, down the whites, maybe bring up the overall exposure and the shadows a little bit more. I like to be careful about shadows because I don't like this look where you can obviously tell that it's sort of high dynamic rangy in the shadows. So rather than doing that, I prefer to bring up the overall exposure and then bring down the highlights and the whites. That to me looks pretty good. Maybe bring down the blacks a little bit more and the shadows slightly. And then we're gonna warm this up because it looks a little bit too cool. And I might straighten this out a little bit for the horizon. I think that looks good. This is a before, this is an after. That looks great. Another image from Dune. Thank you for getting the creative shots. Pro 400H immediately looks beautiful. Here's a before, here's an after. And I might just bring down the highlights to see a little bit more of those clouds, maybe bring down the whites. And we also might straighten this a little bit. There we go. Yep, and that looks gorgeous. Another image here. So we're going to apply Pro 400H. I'm going to bring down the overall exposure, maybe bring up the shadows slightly, bring down the whites, bring down the highlights, and then we'll just adjust the crop here. That looks pretty great. I'm going to bring back the exposure. We may just lean into this little bit of overexposure here. Here's a before, there's the after. And then one more to show you how this preset applies to landscape images, which is actually one of my favorite ways to use it because it creates really timeless, beautiful landscapes. So we're going to apply Pro 400H, and almost immediately it looks absolutely stunning. I'm going to bring down the highlights a little bit. If we bring them down too much, we get some vignetting at the top, but just slightly, maybe bring down the whites slightly. We can just see what this does. And then this is a before, and that's an after. So there you have it. That is how I edit all of my images now. I'm super happy with this editing process because I think that it ensures that the images remain true to the actual day, right? So I'm not modifying the images in a way that says, oh wow, these have been edited. If you're curious about the archetype process and the profiles, I'd love to make another video about it. Just let me know. Hopefully you learned something from this video. And like I said, you know, I would take something from what I've shown you in this video and sort of use that to inform your own style of editing. Don't just copy me and go with that, because chances are it won't be fulfilling, it won't be satisfying, and it won't sort of represent what you want your work to be. So hopefully I can give you a little bit of inspiration, a little bit of encouragement on your way to find an editing style that you're super happy with. If you enjoy this video, please give it a like. If you're new to the channel or haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe. It really helps me out. If you have any questions at all, please leave them down below. I'm happy to answer them in the comments section. Thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye. Love is free.